Good evening, everybody. To those of you who are standing, do you want to take your seats? Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the George Baird Lecture. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Robert Levitt. I'm the acting dean of this faculty. Tonight's going to be the first time that this lecture will be an occasion to honor the memory of George Baird rather than enjoy the pleasure of having George introduce its speaker. Most of you already know the terribly sad news of George's passing 2 days ago, even as he planned his introduction of Bruce Kuwabara tonight. Some of you may be hearing of his death for the first time tonight, and it's with great sadness that I communicate this news to you now. For those closest to George, it has come without surprise. George had been struggling with his health, but even so, his passing is none the easier. For everyone who's known George and whose lives have been touched by him, his absence will leave a very large hole. We're very grateful tonight, though, for the presence of George's wife, Elizabeth. Thank you, Elizabeth, for being here with us, and our heartfelt condolences on your loss. Understandably, Elizabeth will not be lingering at the end of tonight's lecture, so if it's your intention to send her your well wishes, please so in the days that follow. And before I go on, let me make the land acknowledgement. Before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have opportunity to work on this land. As many of you know, the name of the avenue on which our faculty sits, Spadina, comes from the Anishinaabe and means a place on the hill. This site was also an important trail for several First Nations. As an institution committed to the promotion of truth and reconciliation, we note this history and we wish to honor these connections as we move forward collectively. So, and now I hope that you all bear with me tonight, because I'd like to make a longer introduction than I would normally do, and use this occasion to make some remarks in memory of George before I proceed to introducing tonight's speaker, Bruce Kuwabara. So I think I'm going to speak for 15 minutes, about perhaps less. So I hope you have patience. I've known George for many decades, since my first year as a teacher, which for me began at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design in 1994. It was a year after George joined its faculty as a senior member. He was already a renowned architect and critical voice in architecture. This is where I met George, but many of you here have known him for a much, much longer time, perhaps as a teacher and a leader of this faculty as far back as 1967, or after his return in 2004, or as a mentor in his practice, or perhaps some of you primarily through his writings. I mentioned the year that I first met George and the venue simply to point out that while George has been a central figure for the life of architecture in Toronto, his presence has been international. He has educated generations of architects during 2 different eras in Toronto, from the late 1960s through the time of his departure for Harvard in 1994, and then again beginning in 2004 when he returned as dean of this faculty. He also educated a generation of GSD students during his decade-long sojourn there, where he belonged to what many there referred to as the leadership triumvirate, which included Jorge Silvetti and Michael Hayes. But George's impact on architecture is far wider than even his direct role as a teacher and mentor at this or any other school. He has been a critical voice in architecture since his continuous wave of criticism, commentary, and analysis that began in 1969. And in 1995, with the publication of his long-developing book, the space of appearance, he began a final period of intellectual synthesis, evident in that and subsequent books and articles in which the underlying principles shaping his thinking were made evident. George drew upon Hannah Arendt, and in particular her remarkable meditation on political action and physical making in her book, The Human Condition. George could and often did cite from that book verbatim passages that were for him the voice of an interlocutor whom he had internalized. He brought Arendt's notion of homo faber, man the maker, to bear on architecture and its concept of architecture's futurity, its gift to the future. He wrote of architecture's capacity for passing on to the future generations each generation's effort at fashioning a world and its architecture as the stage of human action. He distinguished this effort from the embers of a theory that still persists today, in which architecture is primarily defined by its utility and is no more than the perishable element in the metabolic cycles of what Arendt called the animal laborans, a human creature primarily preoccupied with its own survival and perhaps pleasures, a creature without history. For George, once again putting to use Arendt's concepts, architecture is the site of civic life, of public acts, where history, small and large, is made. Architecture as the site of action. His later book on photography, Public Space, Culture, Political Theory, Street Photography, is his meditation and observation of architecture's role and ability to stage such acts. Photography for him captures the life that the tangible circumstances of architecture sponsor. If all of this sounds airy and abstract, let me say another thing about George. He was also the sort of architect and teacher who would scrutinize in a student review, for instance, the placement of a column in a parking bay, noting when it would interfere with the turning radius of a car. He scrutinized the most material conditions of architecture, and one of the most moving pieces of writing that I just discovered Bruce and I share a love for is where George observed in his small but seminal essay on Alvar Aalto, how Aalto used the travel of the hand on handrails through the library of Viipuri and elsewhere to structure the experience of space. This was George's interest in the haptic, not readily photographed reality of architecture. T.S. Eliot once wrote of the novelist Henry James that he had a mind so refined that not an idea could penetrate it. He meant to pay a compliment to James, that in the end for James, ideas existed through the concreteness of things, of gestures, of the smallest observations of mood and affect. Broad statements were of no value to James. Likewise, for George the architect, the concreteness of architecture, of its physical presence, and the presence also of that voice of the political philosopher Arendt, whose thoughts and words he kept with him as some people do the verses of poets. These were all precise and concrete things. Let me end with these thoughts before turning to my introduction of Bruce. Often in memory of someone who has died, we speak of how they have imprinted themselves, their values, their experiences, wisdom, even defining foibles upon their children, and how in these offspring the parent lives on. I've certainly felt this way in relationship to my own. But in George's case, he has passed on to so many people in this room and elsewhere, people whom he knew well and others whom he has never met, this legacy of who he has been and what he has thought about architecture, politics, the city. We are his heirs, perhaps his progeny, and I think I can say that we carry within us his teachings and wisdom, and for those who knew him personally, we are also marked by the impact of his warmth as a friend and colleague. And it is with these last thoughts in mind that I can turn to my introduction of Bruce Kuwabara, who George wanted so much to introduce tonight. Bruce is clearly one of the many of us who are George's heirs. Bruce belongs to one of those several generations he had given himself to. And in Bruce's case, he is perhaps among the first generation mentored by George's precocious acuity as critic, teacher, architect, and also friend. Bruce Kuwabara is one of the country's best-known architects, an officer of the Order of Canada, and currently chair of the Board of Trustees at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal. An alumnus of our faculty, he acquired his Bachelor of Architecture degree in 1972 and was greatly influenced by George, who was his teacher. After Bruce acquired his degree, he also apprenticed for George and then went on to work for other firms before co-founding KPMB Architects in 1987. For more than 3 decades, KPMB has evolved in response to a changing world and worked to change it for the better. In the process, it has become widely acclaimed for its highly narrative city-building approach to architecture, and Bruce, with his partners, has committed to constructing that civic world that reflects, I think, a central commitment throughout George's thinking. Tonight, Bruce will discuss, through the example of specific buildings, projects, how KPMB's approach to the public realm was shaped by George's views and theories, and how architecture can contribute to the formation and vibrancy of cities while addressing some of the most pressing issues of our time, such as climate change, affordability, mental health, and reconciliation. So please help me in welcoming Bruce to the stage.
Thank you, Robert. This has been quite a week. You know, over probably 2.5 weeks ago, I met with George and Elizabeth, and he told me that he may not make it to this lecture. And I just have to say that, you know, amongst the many things that I think about George Baird, he had courage. He had courage. In the face of real health issues, he was able to kind of really organize and control his destiny, and Elizabeth is a big part of that. I've known George Baird since I was 18, but I know Elizabeth earlier than that, because Elizabeth taught French at my high school in Hamilton. She taught my sister. And in the 60s, she was the teacher who was wearing a white blouse, had a blunt cut, black horn-rimmed glasses, and a black skirt, because she had been at the Sorbonne in Paris, and she really looked like she had been there. We were all saying, like, who is that? In the process of kind of this week, it's just been a nonstop flurry of emails and conversations with a lot of people. Today I got a message from Ken Frampton, who really is a peer of George. And this is what he said: George Baird's death on October 16th leaves us in a state of shock and loss, not only in relationship to the Daniels faculty at the University of Toronto, of which he was for so many years its dedicated and exceptionally creative dean, but also for Canadian and even for world architecture as a whole, given his prolific output as a brilliant writer and engaged critic, not to mention his activities as an inspired teacher in both Canada and the United States. Baird also played a fundamental role in introducing landscape urbanism into architecture, into the school curriculum here, aided, inspired, and partially led by Charles Waldheim. And George had met Charles at the GSD. And from the seminal semiotic anthology that George edited with Charles Jenks, Meaning in Architecture, you have to imagine George was 30 years old when that book came out. I was 20. We've always had this kind of 10-year, maybe it's just me, but I'm very interested in these kind of generations. And so having George as a kind of leader intellectually in the field of architecture made a lot of us feel that we were flying in his slipstream. Frampton says, George and I shared a mutual conviction as to the pertinence for architecture of Hannah Arendt's magnum opus, The Human Condition. Okay, so it's a beautiful photograph, sent by Sharon Mira. And it's a picture of George and Elizabeth and Capri in 2016. Now for me, I spent my entire life trying to figure out how to become a Canadian. And it's been a project of thinking about the internment of my family and 22,000 Japanese Canadians in the Second World War. And now I see that the whole role of the architect has really shifted from that of the 20th century. We're in a different time. The values have shifted. The engagement has shifted, thank goodness. And so this talk is set up not to show details of projects so much as it is to try to just link into some of the themes that I think influenced me because I had a very close friendship and working relationship with George. I worked for George for 3 years. He was my thesis advisor here, along with Ken Greenberg. And when we graduated, John Van Osteren, Joost Bakker, and Barry Sampson and we went to work for George for free because we didn't want to work for anyone else. And we thought George was the most interesting person that we knew. It was an ongoing education. My daughter had a good laugh over this. But I think I'm like 22 or 3, and George was a very cool intellectual. I mean, just the way he carried himself and his connections to London, it was a lot of fun. I mean, he knew everybody. He organized the lecture series here, and everyone who lectured here came to the office, including Rem Koolhaas or Ungers, all of them. They were all in his office. So you have to imagine what it's like when you're 23 or 4 and you're really connecting to the architects who were really significant at that time. And here he is with one of his contemporaries, Peter Eisenman. This is in the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York. But look at George. Look at that intensity, focus, and you know, I always felt that George played at the level of what was happening in the context, whether it was a review or whether it was a symposium or whether it was just lunch. Like it was very fluctuating. It didn't always stay at one level, and I really appreciated that. And this picture I took because I'm not in the picture, so there was this whole invasion of, you know, British music, and I think we thought somehow we were some rock band, and George kind of in a strike the pose, Jagger-esque image. You see John Van Osteren on the far right, Barry Sampson, one of my dear friends who passed away in 2020, and Joost Bakker on the far left. I mean, we self-selected each other to work together. And then these two pictures are like I'm really doing a lot of archival work right now. But I worked for George, although the picture on the left was an amazing event. He and Elizabeth had a picnic on the islands, and they invited everybody who had ever worked for him. So they were all there, Detlef, Bridget, there was fantastic. And it was part of what Robert was talking about, this kind of intergenerational network that George had basically created. And then on the right is, Barton Myers. I worked with him intensively, and he's a big influence, but I'm not really talking about him tonight. I'm really trying to examine the impact of George. But I did want to show this, which is one slide that my friend Don Mackay and I really like a lot, because we went upon graduation to London for 10 weeks to the summer session, which was convened by Alvin Boyarsky. And again, it was a kind of British scene like I've never experienced. Archigram was there, James Sterling, everybody was there, everybody in the world. It was at the Institute for Contemporary Art on the Mall. And that's what George did for me. I mean, he sort of threw us out there into the world and made us realize that architecture, if nothing else, is very international. So look at the people on the right. I mean, it's James Sterling in the top left, Cedric Price in the middle, Robin Middleton, the critic, and Alvin Boyarsky is in the top right. He had a lot of swagger. The person standing in the image on the left is one of the great photographers of British buildings. That's John Donat. And he had the capacity to photograph British buildings in the rain. So then we formed. Barton moved to California. This was in our second year of practice. And we had Tom Payne as a partner, but Shirley and Marianne and me. And we found and tried to work on a different model of practice, one that would really represent the best of all of us. And I remember George giving a lecture. I don't know if any of you were there, but it was an amazing lecture where he showed the work of different architects individually, and then he showed the work that they did together. And his argument was, when they worked together, they made better architecture. And that was kind of the thing we were thinking about. We all felt pretty confident in our individual abilities, but we knew, and I think Barton knew that as well, that we would really come together if we could really find a way to do that and produce something that no individual would have made. And I'm very proud of that. I mean, probably the thing that I'm most proud about, I mean, we've been in practice for 36 years. What I'm most proud about is the fact that we've been able to maintain our values and the quality of our work over a long stretch of time. It's an amazing thing. It's not easy to do. But, I just thank my partners. Marianne and Shirley are here, but our new partners are here. But believe me, it's not easy making buildings. And then we've grown our practice. So we're at the Globe and Mail building, and we have this very dramatic view of the downtown core. And I guess my point is really all architecture is made by teams. There are very few things, unless you're just doing your own house, you can work alone. But as soon as you have two people, you're on a team. And so a lot of our practice was really about understanding the dynamics of teams in the creative process. The books. Just remember, he was 30 years old working with Charles Jenks, and he really put forward the idea that architecture has meaning and that it would really be developed around a system of signification, and that there would be a langue and parole, and the langue was about the rules of the language, and the parole was the way individual architects would use and manipulate that language. Never forgot that. And I wonder, how, it was just so, it seems so simple. I mean, the reason George was a genius to me, because I figured it out, is often The genius is able to tell you what you already intuit. George felt The Space of Appearance was his most important book. And he really believed a lot and was very committed to the ideas of Hannah Arendt. And The Space of Appearance, there's a lot of debate over what it actually is. I mean, for me, the simplest reduction would be it's the public realm. But I think for George, there are all sorts of philosophical aspects to existence and the ability of individuals to act out their political lives in space. On the left, mutual dear friend, Francesco Garofalo. A lot of you have met him. He's Italian. I met him doing study abroad in 1985, and he's brilliant, and he's gone. He was one of the biggest losses I've ever experienced in my entire life. He put together a compendium of writings on architecture in the city and worked collaboratively with George. Francesco is really an Italian intellectual, and he found his peer in George, and they worked on this book. This is a fantastic document. What I'm happy about is George's books are going to be around for quite a while. And then here at the school, Roberto Damiani did this more recently, The Architect and the Public. So there's the Hannah Arendt reference, and there are a series of interviews and essays, but it's another really good read. And look, this is in the innocent 60s where people have set squares and, drafting equipment, sit in rows. Ted Tsushima was one of George's closest friends. He was Ray Moriyama's partner. And Ted is someone who always kind of looked over me because we do have a kind of indirect relation. At George's office, we went between doing major pieces of public policy on the city. On the left was On Building Downtown, which was part of the city's ramping up to converting the central business district into a mixed-use precinct. And it was really about understanding the structure, the urban structure of Toronto. And I learned so much. The city on the lake, hence Front Street, city between two river valleys, the Humber and the Don. The second front is up on St. Clair, Scaramouche. The British grid, the Roman grid, Yonge Street, Bloor Street, the arterials. And then the fact that public buildings in the city face the lake, hence this building, the Connaught building, Command, Spadina, I love it. Old City Hall, the Tower of E.J. Lennox, the legislative buildings at Queen's Park, Upper Canada College. And I'll show you this was fun. I went into the archives and I pulled out a project. I did this right out of school with George and Barry and John, because we didn't know anything. And so this was for a back porch addition to a house in the beach. And all I want to point out is George was absolutely preoccupied by mirroring this central column outside at the line of the sliding door. So the whole deck, it's not entirely the whole deck, but that column is the symbol. And George was very interested in the architectural promenade. And so even though this is a little bungalow with a deck, just notice that the cap of the deck is grating. And his expectation is that you would walk out and then you would turn and you would look back at the house. And he was explaining this to me. I was saying, why do you want to do that? But for him, it was about moving people through buildings, regardless of how modest they are, so that there's some point where you have an amazing recognition of who you are in that space. So the angle of this faces the lake, and it was to let light under that west-facing porch. So we finally got to do a ground-up building, and of course it never got built. But in the ramp-up to this talk, only George and I worked on this house. It was for an Indian doctor and his family in North York. And recently I pulled out Aldo van Eyck's pavilion, which has now been reconstructed. I think we have to go see it. But I asked George about the five, the parallel concrete block walls. In Aldo van Eyck's work, it's it's one of the masterpieces of modern architecture. With George, but he acknowledged it. I finally said, hey, were you thinking about this? But what it was we saved the tree in the courtyard, and then the concrete block walls were composite walls. There was siding on the front facade. There were 5 bays. There was a swimming pool, and in the swimming pool, the concrete block was glazed concrete block. There was a system of skylights across the bays, the acrylic skylights, and the beams were timber. And then when we were working for Barton, Tom and I, we were moonlighting, and we did this addition to a house on St. Clair for a doctor. And it was one room that we wanted to make as large as possible, like 24 feet square, like this dimension is 24 feet, but the tree was there, so we used glass block and we curved the facade to let that tree live. But the thing I like is that the shadow of that tree is in the room. You're very aware of it. And then this little house that I worked with only one other person, Evan Weber, and I'm really happy he's here. I think Todd Masick worked a bit on it, but it was primarily Evan. And it's a house in Richmond Hill, and it was an artist studio and a writer's studio, and they had 2 young children, and it was going to be, there was a really tight budget, and so somehow I had been to Montreal, and I saw a garage in Westmount that was made out of split-face concrete block, and I realized that if the joints were tight, it had a great effect. It sort of became monolithic. So that's what we did. And then on the right, I don't know if any of you know this, architect, but he was a monk, Hans van der Laan, and I got totally into his monasteries and his religious work. It had that kind of certainty. 2 of the most engaging books of that time, Team 10 Primer. I hope you know what that is, but that is, Allison and Peter Smithson, Giancarlo De Carlo. These were the second generation of modern architects, second generation after Le Corbusier, who were critical of SIAM and the planning strategies and wanted to show an alternative, and they came up with Team 10 Primer. They had their own conferences. Aldo van Eyck was part of it, and I was totally in love with it. And on the right, this was the pushback, so that's 1964. And by 78, so 14 years later, another group of European architects, led by the Creer brothers and Raphael Maneo, O.M. Ungers, they came out with this, which was a reconstruction of the European city. And they were offering different visions of urbanism and therefore the role of architecture within that urbanism. The project that I absolutely loved the most, and so did my classmates, was the Free University of Berlin. We thought that was it. That was the call to make a 3-dimensional public realm. We thought this was the greatest project we had ever seen in the world. And it was a university building where a building sat within, you can sort of see the street grid, but it was multi-level. And all of these, Candelas, Josic, and Woods, they all worked for Le Corbusier, so they're breaking away. And I juxtaposed that with Leon Creer's Royal Mint Square competition, which is on the ground, has public space in the diagonal, has a kind of social center, and incorporates existing buildings. And I saw something in that was really, really important, that you could intensify the city, you could make changes, but you had to recognize the urban context. And then I went to the Free University of Berlin, and it was just devastating. I just hated it. I went to all of the projects with streets in the air, Robin Hood Gardens. You know, I thought the Smithsons were the greatest thinkers ever. I went to Herman Hertzberger's student housing. I thought that was the greatest. He showed great pictures, but I went there. And I realized, like, maybe I was going down the wrong path. So now I'm going to try to get through this. These are themes. There are projects attached to the theme, but the themes interrelate. There's no binary relationship between either George and one of our projects because he wasn't working on them. And there's no relationship that defines a single project by a single theme. But I'm telling you that in this kind of evolution, all of these have become very active in our practice. And we always did renovations and additions to existing buildings. I think that was another lesson of George, because all we did with George were additions. And so you had to learn how to read the structure of an existing architecture and then respond. And I think that was the training that gave us the capacity to deal with fabric and existing buildings. A lot of our buildings are not standalone. There are very, very few of them. Even this one is not standalone. This is Remai Modern. And in general, it's part of the public realm. But let me say that it's a gallery that replaced the Mendel Gallery in Saskatoon, which was loved, and that decision had been made before we were selected. But what I thought was interesting in the brief was that they called for two things. They wanted a winter haven and a community hub. They wanted the ground floor to be a living room for all of the city on the river. And this is another looping move, because Raymond Moriyama in the 70s did the 100-year plan for the Meewasin Valley Authority, and the red dot is the downtown, and we're at the lower end of the red dot. The South Saskatchewan River comes down, and it flattens out at the downtown, and our building doesn't even occupy the whole site. What we've done is we had to attach our building, connect it to a theater called the Persephone Theater, and we had to extend 2nd Avenue to the river. We had an L-shaped plan. It's very difficult with underground services. But when Shirley and I went out there, this is the first thing we did. We went to the other side of the river. So I suggest if you ever get onto a river, you should go to the other side to look at the site. And the zone that is in the blue is the key public zone of the gallery. It eventually becomes that public connection between Rivers Landing and all the investment that the city of Saskatoon has made. There's a senior citizens home. We were really looking at all the elements from the water's edge up to the penthouses. And then I knew through Karen Wilkin, who was an art critic, about William Parahudoff, who interestingly was trained at a school in New York run by Aux Enfants, for whom Le Corbusier did the great studio. And there was a kind of response between a public art piece and the Idlewild Bridge. And we kept asking ourselves, how many floors is this building going to be? That's one of the first questions we ask. But it took us to, it's going to be 4. And then these are, I mean, they're not renderings. I mean, they're trying to find a way to connect things I don't necessarily believe are so perfectly designed, but they're there. and there's an existing condition. There is no tabula rasa. So our instinct was to really develop the entrance so that it made sense of everything around it, and to ultimately we pushed out a multi-purpose room on the second floor that allows you to stand there and look back into the city. We worked with Philips Farvag Smallenberg on the landscape, and we tried to connect everything to the outside. It's an interesting plan. You can enter from 2nd Avenue and walk right through the building, through the cafe, and out to the south, or vice versa. And I got that idea from the Emily Carr building that the Patcows did, and at Granville, where you just with some openings, you can just cross through the gallery diagonally. It's an amazing phenomenon. So you can see the back of house. What I really want to point out is George's thinking about the public realm and the choreography of movement. So you enter, we put the elevators in the inside L of the L-shaped available site. And what it means is that every time you come out of that elevator on every floor, you're oriented to the river. And for me, that was George. We could have put the elevators anywhere. We could have put them over here, for example, but that was really a key move. And we connect, number 17 connects to the yellow, which is the Persephone Theater, and Paulo and Matthew Wilson worked very hard on this project. And I jumped to the 3rd floor, where it's a steel building with 18-meter spans, which gives Remai Modern an incredible infrastructure with museum standards. When you come out of every gallery, you get a filtered view of the river. And number 6, you'll see later, is this kind of major cantilever. We cantilevered really far out into the west and to the south because there were services under the site, and we were losing gross floor area that we needed. And then this section, you can see this is 2nd Avenue. You come in flush. The new director, Greg Burke, reversed the first stair, but we always had the second stair, and we interlocked 2 atriums which allow you to have connectivity and awareness right through the building as you move from ground to second to third. Offices are up in the yellow, and they are cantilevered off the end of the building, and they're just a loft. We also have a deck at the very top of the building that the gallery allows the community to use. So this was it. Think about those Parahudoff and the strata and the connection to the river and the projection of that piece way out there. I think it's like 30 feet or so. And then the Winter Haven and the living room and the main lobby. But, the artwork, Haig Yang's piece, which is amazing, isn't there anymore. It now has Spinner Forest by Nick Cave. That's amazing. That's worth going out there for. And this I found really remarkable. Thomas Hirschhorn, the artist, he did a project where he came to the gallery. There he is. But he came for like 6 or 7 weeks. And he created this project called What I Can Learn From You, What You Can Learn From Me. And he invited all the people in Saskatoon to come, and they papered up our white cube gallery so you couldn't recognize it, but I think it's incredibly beautiful. So they were presenting to each other every day. And there were people who have never been in a gallery or ever been in this gallery. And then from a show a few years ago that Gerald McMaster was curator, but he worked with a group called Post Commodity. And these are in our big, I mean, they're really, really flexible, but they have a lot of hanging points, or there's secondary systems that allow you to hang. This one is about the problem of water in Indigenous communities, and it's right out there. And this one is a kind of deconstruction, reinstallation of a roof type in a suburban development, which has been kind of excavated or taken away and represented as a kind of trophy. Second one is at Princeton, where, again, why did we get Princeton? We got a call, and they said, did we do the James Stewart Center at McMaster? It's the James Stewart Center for Mathematics, and we said yes. And they said, did you do the Gardner Museum? We said yes. Did you do the Museum of Nature? We said yes. And they said, do you want to be on a short list? And we said, we'll think about it. No, we said yes. So this building used to be for chemistry, and it has this cladding which is called argillite. It's very speckly, and then there's Indiana limestone trim, and it's very big. It's 200,000 square feet. So, Princeton, they have a lot of resources, but they had hired Michael Hopkins to do a building for chemistry. So chemistry moved out, leaving a 1929 collegiate Gothic building. They called us, we were in a competitive situation. And they have a master plan that called for filling in, that was an exterior atrium, and there was another interior one. So the first building at Princeton is outlined in red, smaller, that's Nassau Hall, Nassau Street. This is Washington Road, and it rises up to Scudder Plaza, south of the red outline, and that rectangle, which we also renovated, was designed by Minoru Yamasaki, and that's Scudder Plaza between them. So what Princeton does, which is super intelligent, is they're trying to create academic clusters, academic neighborhoods, and for this one it was like the humanities. Just closer in, so Scudder Plaza, Washington Road, and some of the most important buildings at Princeton are right across the street. McCosh Hall is the lecture hall. There's the chapel, which is super beautiful, and the library, which has also got a huge footprint. But when you look at the footprint of this building, it's really quite massive, and it was 1929, then 1965, and then there was a 1990s addition, a laminar addition of offices to chemistry, and we took it away. And what Princeton does that's really intelligent is we don't have a loading dock. They organize services by precinct, but they also name some of the most important walks after presidents. So Shapiro was Canadian, and he was a president of Princeton. So the two green elements were in Princeton's master plan. They said, this is what we want. And so really our job was to kind of reconceptualize the building, knowing that those would be there. And there are two departments. One is economics. And at Princeton, they're very powerful. They have Nobel Prize winners, and they're often seconded to the White House, and they really wouldn't mind being in an ivory tower. And the other part of it was international initiatives, which was the opposite. They want to be connected to everybody else. So, our team and Shirley and David Jessen, who's no longer with us, they did an incredible job of making 18 departments comfortable. and move in to create. And the George Baird aspect of this, for me, was given the size of the floor plate, could you pull the campus through the building to break it down? It's a big building. And the section at Washington's on one side, Shapiro Walk's on the other side, the two atriums, and we were trying to connect vertically, so we floated, a meeting room in the economics forum where everything is more internal, and we took the atrium for international initiatives and pushed it right to the face of the building and made this building handicapped accessible. It's totally accessible, this ramp, these stairs. And we worked with Michael van Valkenburg, who is really, really good. And they had been part of Princeton's master plan that our project was part of. And at Princeton, another intelligent thing they do is they have different architects, but the same landscape architect for 10 years. Because a lot of the systems that they're working on are large scale, stormwater management, reforestation. But what we found, I think, was a way to use every piece of this kind of building with wings and sort of pavilions on the end. This is up in economics, but we placed 3 rooms spaced apart by the fireplaces, and they look right back to McCosh. So these are the 3 rooms, and it was really a bit of a replay, because Shirley and I went up on the roof, and we said, here it is. This is it. And Princeton accepted it. The thing I really like about Princeton is that it's not homogeneous, and that they have some of the great historical architecture, and then they have contemporary architecture. As you move south and east, the accessibility is here on the right side. This was the economics forum, where I think we surprised them because people actually like being here. And you move up into the walkways that were in the plan, and they're all clad with limestone, and they have bluestone on the ground, which is the characteristic stone of the walkways at Princeton. So this, I love this. I mean, it's all, like, that's light to the level below. That platform where the lounge is floating in light. The box has a meeting room, and you see layers and layers and layers from 1929 up until, this major intervention. And then the international initiatives atrium is has a different problem. We pulled the structure away from the heritage walls. We dropped the structure in. We made a very gentle stair up, connecting the levels. You see all the layers of the building, and we have an elevator. And it's become a very popular, quote, public space. Thank you, George. And then in Boston, we won a competition. This was with Marianne, Luigi, Paulo. We had quite a big team, Kevin. But this was for a large building for data sciences at Boston University. And across the river, you're on the Charles River. This is Commonwealth Avenue. Ken Greenberg had done the master plan for BU and identified this site for a competition. And I've never won a competition where Moshe Safdie was in the competition. This is the exception. So data BU, their big idea, their big proposition is that data sciences are the tool for problem solving in all disciplines, not just engineering and mathematics, but also public health, obviously geography, planning, all of it goes through here. And what's amazing is that we won, and it got built, but it was put on the shelf for 4 years They didn't have the money, but there was a lot of excitement building about the building. The red dot is the site. BU has a long, thin campus on the Charles, and you see the Back Bay, Olmsted's, Gardens, Boston Commons. You get the beautiful Commonwealth Avenue. And then it's not so beautiful when it comes by our building. It gets rougher, the streetcars come up out of the ground, but we're right across from MIT. And one of the good things after the competition, they added, the building got bigger, the program got bigger, so what was a 14-story building became a 19-story building, and the proportions got better. And the top left is one of the buildings I've always liked, Jose Luis Sert, and it's now been renovated for the Faculty of Law. This big, what we call, I don't know how to call it, but this is fairly Boston, sort of setbacks, limestone brick, cornices. That's the School of Business, the Carleton School of Business. And there is this one green space. You'll see it. There are 3 buildings. I think we have buildings that look like that in Toronto. But this was to be a convergence. And so the issue that I would say relates to George is, how do you build the street wall and be part of Commonwealth Avenue, but also open the building up as a public space? These are really quick. The key thing was to locate the core to align with the end of a Back Bay townhouse. And then, because BU owns it all, we could move the floor plates around. So our argument was that traditional campuses are 3- and 2-story buildings. BU has many of them, and that we were stacking them with a square plan around a square core. And every time you would get a terrace for a department. And people have called it all kinds of crazy names. We've never done a building where people say, Jenga, or they say something like, stack of books. But we don't care, actually, because we know it's not any of those. And we know that it's a steel building with incredible cantilevers again, and amenity. And then on the top, there's an outdoor courtyard with the best view of the Charles and the downtown. So this is pretty recent, this photograph, but the diagonals, I'll explain those. There are 2 facade treatments. This is the part that people don't understand. George was really interested in this because he couldn't figure it out. And what it is solar shading on the southwest corner is that corner, and we had Transolar model it. And then where you see the vertical stripe, we're well under 50% glazing to solid, and I'll show you how the system works. And then there's a food pavilion on the roof, which looks over Commonwealth. It's pretty nice. But there is a constant parade of people moving along this linear spine called Commonwealth, going into the building. Here's the ground floor. The core sort of pushed off the edge. There are a lot of views through to what's called the Grove. BU owns all of the buildings on Bay State Road. We redid the laneway and made them all accessible. That's what they wanted. There's outdoor bike storage against the Sargent building. And one of the big moves was to take Commonwealth Avenue up into the building to the 2nd floor, and to lift the building so that you can see right through the building. So it's transparency, and I have to give Paulo a lot of credit for really resolving the base of the ramp, because no one in Boston liked it, because that ramp came right down. They were saying you're just going to get like cans and garbage. And then there was an amazing stair. We had many different versions, but this one is so dynamic, and it really relates to, I think, the scale of the building in the city. So there's the platforms of collaboration. There, when we started, the director of one of the institutes told us, look, this is not about computers. It's about people and flow, engagement. So this is the facade system where you see the diagonals, you have a deeper core to perimeter depth and bigger rooms like that classroom and some offices. On the other side, you only have offices, so there's an asymmetrical shifting of the square around the core. So this is the offices. When you see this, it's a sign of offices, but the really brilliant thing was that there are no offices in the corner. There are no corner offices. And the other thing is that interconnecting stair runs right through the building from the 4th level up. And it keeps people off the elevators. That's what its intention is, so that you could have a department and just go up or down. It's like having an office with an interconnecting stair. But in a building like this, what you don't want is there not to be options if there's ever, an issue with elevators. But the structure, I really have to say, Lemessurier and Intuitive collaborated on this, and they did an amazing job. This is so complicated because you're seeing the diagonal steel, it's exposed, intumescent, and people, I love this picture because these students are doing their own thing, but they're in the kind of architecture of the facade. Or this is one of those open corners, which, I think students really like them. This is just some drone footage that BU took because they got really excited about the building because it's carbon neutral. It has 31 geothermal holes drilled 1,500 feet into the ground. It has a high-performance curtain wall. And it's caused quite a stir. We get emails, and everybody wants to tour the building. I don't think we've ever done it. I mean, Kerner Hall, everybody wants to visit that building. I know why, but believe me, there are a lot of people who want to visit this building. And the Citgo sign, Fenway Park. So part of our getting approvals, we had to make the case for why this building, and we had to speak about it in relationship to José Luis Serret, and somehow the day was won. But you also get, I think I.M. Pei's building, the Hancock building, and I think Pereira did the other tower. The city saw those as a set, and these as a set, and then you get the historical building by Cram, who was the probably the #1 collegiate Gothic architect in America. This is a George Baird theme for sure. 5 years ago, we won the competition for a 13-acre site in Hamilton, which is where I'm born. I actually grew up on this aerial. I grew up 5 blocks from the site. It's called Pier 8. It was landfill, and it used to be for the Navy and shipping. And now there's a marina. There's all sorts of stuff going on there. But this was a developer proposal call, and we were teamed up with Citizen and with Tercott, and we decided, and it's more my belief system as well, that one architect ought not to design the whole thing. It'd be really hard to get the diversity that I think we needed. And so what we did is we had a lot of fun. We just picked up the phone and we invited like Pat Hansen, then we invited Supercool, and we invited Omar Gandhi. And they were delighted, and we met every week preparing the competition, and it was like school. We reviewed each other's projects. It was so collegial, and that's what the connection is to George Baird, because he was very intergenerational. And I think it's really important that cities are also intergenerational. They're all not just spanking brand new. And so we were tasked with developing a language of materials. It'll be brick for sure, and steel. Not all the same, it won't be all brick. But we had nicknames for different buildings. That there was the pier building on the far left. And there's a marina building. There's water on 270 degrees around the site. So this is who got to do what. So Omar's in purple, super cool. Pat is kind of undersubscribed. I think she should do another building over here, just because she should, and she's really good. And then we did exercises like this in the competition, where we tried to set the rules for the 2 floors of all the buildings, and we had a lot of fun. And it was so good to hear from people who've worked for us before and where they were at right now, because Andre and Meg worked for us, and so did Omar. And then the Water's Edge was won in a competition, and it's built. That yellow frame is built. And so we are now looking at this group of buildings, starting at the east and then building, to the west. And there's a very controversial proposal for a tower, which I'm not supposed to talk about. This is actually quite nice. This is Omar. And then there is a green spine. The water is 1 block to the left. You're heading east, and you're getting super cool, who are, frankly, very good students. They were doing the townhouses. And then we worked with Francesco Valente, of course. It was a kind of nautical theme. Super Cool also is doing this building that's peeking out with the round windows. I think it's fantastic, really fantastic. We're doing the red pier building to kind of anchor and create a kind of industrial, linear docklands architecture. That's what we want to do. And Pat was doing all the landscape. And then affordability. This is in Ottawa, where we're teamed up with Perkins and Will and Peter Busby. And this is interesting because for those of you who know Ottawa, you can see the hill, you can see Safety. Diamond Schmidt are doing Adasoki, the building with the green roof. It's the Central Library and Archives. And this is Albert Street. This is Booth Street. Booth Street goes over Le Breton Flats to the War Museum and goes on to the islands that are called Zibi. That station is one of Ottawa's LRT stations called Pimisi. It's very important, and there's an aqueduct in there. The site that we got to work on was this one, and the competition brief actually proposed you could do 3 smaller towers, and we worked with Peter Busby, and I don't know if any of you have worked with him, but he's a very strong thinker, and we both came to the conclusion that we wouldn't do 3, we would only do 2, and open the site up, because there was a 3rd tower in the middle, and we said, I don't think that's going to be good. And this is affordable housing in Ottawa, so our understanding is that it's $1.92 per square foot per month. That defines affordability. If you're higher, people can't afford it. So you have to reverse engineer the whole thing. That's why these 2 towers are identical, except one's a bit taller. And they both share an angled roof. There's solar on the roof. Peter's incredibly aggressive with energy. So between the station and this podium, there is the abandoned Wellington Street right-of-way where there's a sewage main. And so we're capturing biomass, waste heat from that. And plus we're capturing heat from the sewage from the two towers. The podiums give us large floor plates and super large terraces for urban farming. Some of the floors have uses which are, for example, at terrace, there's a daycare center, but there's a floor for single mothers with children. There's one for Army, veterans, and there's a whole Indigenous floor. But what's interesting is we took all of the loading over to Empress, so as soon as you step onto the site, you're at the station. We said, our concept is we're going to make the station precinct, so as soon as you cross Albert, you're in. So there's the site. This is sort of breaking out the podiums. I think one of the innovations, this was a sketch about the podiums would be reference to the escarpment and be very horizontal, and the towers would go straight up. And the towers ended up with all the two-bedroom units are in the corner, so you actually get really nice, really great views from here all over. So everything here is pedestrianized on Albert. The front doors of the two towers are on Albert, that's their address. All the traffic is this way. The daycare is up on 2, and one of our innovations was to bring the amenity space for the residential. There's 600 units, 40% are affordable, and we brought down the community hub, meeting room, and a bike repair and storage facility onto the ground further. If you go through there, you'll see it. We're working with Brian Porter, and there's an Indigenous gathering place where the two buildings, the two podiums come together. And then I've been working on Center for Addiction and Health for 20 years, and this project was a competition we won for a building that tries to make the healthiest research building ever. It's taking all the lessons from Manitoba Hydro. It has a double wall, windows that open, all the stuff we learned. I worked with Luigi and Kale on Manitoba Hydro, and this building has everything that we learned, except that it's curved, but it's curved efficiently on the perimeter. And in the 19th century, this is more George, the Don Jail was put on the other side of the Don River because if you broke the law, they exiled you. And the asylum, the Toronto Asylum, was put as far west on Queen Street as you could, out of sight and out of mind. This was John Howard's building, the asylum, and note that these wings are like mid-rise housing, and then this was the central palatial ends. And then people talk about stigma, and there was a lot of real criticism of the architecture as being the problem, and Jack and others fought to try to preserve it, but they were not successful. And then, it had this building. Look at this building. It's a modern building that's exactly the same length of the Heritage Building. It's almost like censored. If you don't see it, you don't know it's there. But people never wanted to walk on the south side of Queen Street in this area because there was a stigma. People were afraid. And then we won over 20 years ago the competition we did with Montgomery Sizem and Kearns Mancini of blocks of buildings. The competition brief by Urban Strategies had long blocks. I went back and put the east-west street to make smaller blocks, which gave them more flexibility, I think, and kind of formatted this as a little city. extended, connected to Ossington and all the streets, and Adelaide is across the top. And the site for the research building is that one, which is this one. And we worked with an American lab consultant. So these were, for those of you who've ever done healthcare, you get a functional plan and a stacking and a demonstration plan, which is just like a giant block. There's no idea of a building. And so across the top, you can see us just struggling to break it down. And we're getting nowhere. They're ridiculous. Until we started in the middle one, where I was thinking, you need to get light into the park. The afternoon light has to come into the park. This building has 50,000 square foot floor plates, so they're huge. Like Bay Adelaide Centre has 25,000 square feet, so imagine how big these are. So then we started to develop the next set, which becomes the building. And there was a lot of excitement, but believe me, we did not start with the image of the brain. We started with the move that we got to get light into the, and it happened to create two hemispheres. And these are some sketches, early probing everything that's possible. You know, Don Mackay once told me that architecture is a compelling fiction, and it's taken me a long time to actually agree with him. But we were looking at the brick wall, for example, and one of our ideas was that there would be these portals which would have, highly polished metal, that you would see yourself making that transition at the wall, because mental health issues are everyone's issues. And then we broke it down. We said, okay, there's animal care, there's a 2-story pavilion above the wall, they're concrete, and then the sanctuary is a hybrid steel and timber building, very flexible. The labs are on the west side, and on the roof, people wanted a beacon, but it's basically a function room. And then in the middle, this was the sketch to try to find a way that the middle could be where collaboration and movement occurs, and it would be a scissor stair that moves through the building diagonally. And I had been to Rafael Maneo's Davis Gallery at Wellesley, and there's a scissor stair there, and it's incredible. So I wanted to do a scissor stair. And then on the roof, there was a view. They wanted a global icon, and I said, where are all the people? Well, they're at the CN Tower. Can they see our site? Can we see them? Rendering of going up above the wall on the ground floor. And really, it's very public. I mean, CAMH sees this as their campus hub. This is in the middle where the stairs go up, 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 and it's also the ventilation strategy. And all of these areas have access to an outdoor terrace, and they are all about collaboration. The labs are over here. Double wall, green terraces, event space on the roof, looking out towards the city of trees. Last project. We're working at Queen's University on the Agnes Etherington Art Center, and we're in the midst of it, but I thought that it would be really important just to say something about it. Our team and our client, we were in Brazil, and we presented it in Sao Paulo to the Society of Architects, only to find that the issues are common and pretty universal around the world. Agnes Etherington had this house which she bequeathed to Queen's, but we also found out that's not the original house. It was a Victorian house. It became a Georgian house. Diamond Schmidt had done the galleries, which we call the 2000 galleries, and Queen's said that they would keep the galleries, but they actually felt for the project and connectivity that they would remove the ground floor lobby and take down a very bad 1970s brick building. You can't see it, our building, it's gone. And you see the slope of University Avenue, and one of the key moves is to make that house accessible, and we oriented the new entrance to the south rather than here. And the landscape is completely naturalized, and you actually don't go through here. You actually go to Bannery Hall, which is the social hub, or you come in on this side, come in on the ends. The third floor is art conservation. The ground floor is a gathering place. The second floor is the Indigenous Self-Determination Center. The second floor that connects the two are the offices for Agnes. The house is being converted into a home again. There have been projects there. It's very exciting, amazing. So here we are in the 19th century, and Queens hasn't even started. The red dot is our site. And if there ever was the seat of the colonial, I would nominate Kingston. And you see, it got all generations of modern buildings, but University Avenue has limestone buildings. This is an incredible park. There's a walkway that comes across this park. This is Nixon Field, and the walkway is called Professor's Walk, which I love. It reminds me of Princeton, and I love it, that as an idea. A Lady of Smoke has done an outdoor Indigenous gathering pavilion, which is built, and it's quite beautiful. So how would you address this project? You've got Bannery Hall, you've got precast buildings, stone buildings, and we decided to really think of this beyond the scale of the site and its boundaries. So we have these historical photos of the larger Agnes house and not the most diverse group of students since 1958. I guess I understand. And the two elements that are dotted in are coming down, and are the walkways and the ramps being taken out. And the director of the gallery did an amazing thing to kind of invite people onto the site. So there's the graffiti project, which is amazing. People were coming, people who've never been to Queens came and were dancing and eating, and it's a beautiful project. In the house and in the galleries, these are the kinds of re-inhabitation. This is our section on engagement, but this is the project which has, kind of thinking about decolonization from the inside out, from the ground up. And it starts with the people that were actually hired, the curators, conservationists, everyone. And it's a very different moment. And I think a lot of people are looking at this very carefully, because a lot of these artists were never in that house before, and it was treated more like a historical artifact. And so they have a great collection by the Baders. They have 3 Rembrandts. But this kind of circle and meeting within the art and having those conversations, I think, is really central to the project. This is our diagram about engagement, and I would just say that we have been working for a year and a half on what are called sharing circles, and we have another one coming up. But these are where we have kind of really tried to cultivate the ideas of the project. I don't know where George sat on the issue of engagement, public engagement. This is a drawing by Jennifer Nagai, which I really like, because it's basically projecting the idea of flow beyond the framework of Queen's University. This was presented by Georgina Riel, Emily Changer, who's here. Really glad she's here. She flew today. she proposed making the house, the Agnes Etherington house, a home again. Georgina Riel, who is our Indigenous consultant, she talked about the womb, our mother's womb, as the first house, and she was specifically talking about the wigwam. But we said, we're not going to make, a wigwam. She said, I know, I just want you to be inspired. So the scheme is in the orange are the 2000s galleries. They're quite good that you can just move through them, but they're frankly classical enfilade. The loading comes in the back. We have storage and kitchen and so on, but the new figure is what we have called affectionately at different times, and the lily and the mushroom, but there's an outdoor gathering place between the fireplace of Agnes Etherington and the new side-by-side gathering place. There are 2 elevators, which is strange, but it's the only way we could solve accessibility going from a flush at grade accessible, fully accessible for buses off of Bader Lane. Buses or Wheel-Trans, you go in, you take an elevator up, or you take the stair. But we added to the house 2 porches, one on the south side and one on the north side. You can see the ramps that go up. That little triangular dot at the top is an entrance to a cafe, which was the original kitchen of the house. And we've tried to rethink, the idea of reception desks. We're really looking at not making this feel just like it shouldn't feel like the Remai Modern, for example. The scale is completely different. We have a gallery at grade right on the vestibule, and you will see that when you're coming from parking, which is under the field. Then Emily said, can you draw a view looking away from the building? So you see the fireplace of Agnes, you see Kingston Hall, Professor's Walk, and we didn't even know what we were doing, but all we knew is that we wanted to connect across University Avenue to those buildings. Second floor, the circular space is the Indigenous gathering place. We're still working on it. There's a kind of carrying place for artifacts, and that's all being resolved and worked out. But there are concepts that I like, where that little curved piece near the offices is actually a kitchen that can be used by groups using the Indigenous gathering circle. And then there's an area of the darker red is, an institute for curatorial studies. A lot of things have to interact. I mean, Emily talks about it as entanglement, and this is starting to get that right level of entanglement. This is the art conservation floor with major clear span conservation labs and all of the imaging labs, and the only place where we can get light is out on the east side, and we're going to get that light. It's the last image where you're really trying to open up the Beeler studio. Agnes Etherington really liked this artist and dedicated a studio to him. That's our porch. The glass is turning, you're seeing exterior solar shading and the fireplace with the ivy on it. There's a curtain that creates acoustic and visual privacy. The big wall outside of the 2000s gallery is really a wall, a very public wall, although after going to Brazil, I heard murmurs that it may not be as flat as we've been drawing it. So this is the end here. I've known George since I was 18. He was my professor. I worked for him for 3 years with Barry Sampson and John Van Ostren, Joost Bakker. John left, Joost left, Don Mackay came, Robert Hill, who you should know, came. And one of the things that I most respect about George, because often he was the smartest person in the room. You could actually, you're not supposed to say that, but I can tell you that his knowledge base is so wide, his curiosity covered everything: film, fashion, cars, you name it, food, cities, art, politics, provincial, municipal issues. He was all over it. Like, I was amazed. Like, how can someone be that curious? And Barry called him Curious George, and I don't think George liked it that much, but it was kind of true. So anyways, what I'd like to do is I got another email. It was from Mirko Zardini, who was the past director of the CCA, and this is what he wrote about George. It was the summer of 2019, touring Toronto with George Baird as a personal guide, driving from the Sharon Temple in Gwillimbury to the University of Toronto campus in Scarborough, both in the outskirts and into the city's downtown, while talking about the problems of the city he loved and studied so deeply, and for which he did so much in every possible way, was a delightful, rare privilege. I will never forget it. And it was very rare because, in fact, George belonged to that generation of architects born in the 20s and 30s, with the likes of Frampton, Grigotti, Ungers, Rossi, Eisenman, DiCarlo, Calhoun, Jenks, Grassi, Moneo, that by embodying multiple roles, profoundly shaped the architectural and urban discourse from the post-war years until today. George Baird was simultaneously and inseparably an architect, an urban designer, a historian, a critic, a theorist, and probably above all, a teacher and mentor for many. After working on meaning in architecture in 1969 with Charles Jenks, George kept looking at the city, its architecture, public space, from exceptional perspectives. I really invite you to read some of the essays. I've been rereading them, and I thought I had digested them, but George, you got to read them at least twice. He was also responsible for bringing the works of Hannah Arendt, Jürgen Habermas, and Ivan Illich into architectural discourse. George Baird dedicated his life to architecture, becoming a crucial protagonist in shaping the architectural, urban, and academic worlds in Canada and elsewhere. The breadth of George's legacy is to be fully understood. In the meantime, the best way to honor his life is by keeping his teachings and extraordinary commitment alive. Thank you very much. This photograph was taken by Michael Prokopow in a Gertrude Jekyll garden, and I just think, you have two Order of Canadas walking side by side, and someone said, well, they were in completely different fields. But the reality is that food and architecture, even talking with my friend Ante, we evaluate cities by food and architecture. And many of the most important conversations that we had when we were working for George were at their home, where Elizabeth was doing test recipes for her cookbook. She did several. But the first one that I remember was classic Canadian cooking, and it had a poached salmon on the cover, which I ate, and I loved it. And the conversation was always at the table, and we became, with a group of people, really close friends through the pandemic. And what I realized, and I think all of you realized, is that, you choose your friends, and friendship is maybe one of the most important parts of your life. It's not networks, it's friendships, real friendships. And that's the lesson I got out of George, and I'm going to miss him, as you will. But I like Mirko's sentiment, so. Where did Robert go? I think we should just ask them.
Speaking of food, we could go outside. There's food in the commons for everybody, but does anybody have a question they'd like to ask Bruce? Okay. I feel like we should go out and have some food, mingle, and speak with each other. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. It was great to have you, and thank you, Bruce, so much. It was fantastic.
So.